Today is January 26, 2024. My name is Cameron Wood. I'm here with Kelly Altenberger at the Ohio History Connection, and we're going to talk about his life and the life of Louis Escobar of Toledo. Mr. Altenberger, can you please say and spell your name for me?
My name is Kelly Altenberger. It's Kellyaltenberger.
Thank you. Where and when were you born?
I was born in a previous century on December 13th, 1951 in Marion, Ohio.
Mm-hmm. What was it like growing up in Marion, Ohio?
I thought Marion was interesting. It's this kind of not really small town. It's a little larger than a small town, but a lot of people knew each other. I thought the school system was interesting. We had a series of elementary schools, then 3 junior highs, and then 1 high school. So as you got older, you got introduced to everybody in town your age, which was kind of fun. Mm-hmm. I liked Marion.
Mm-hmm. What did your parents do in Marion?
My parents?
Yeah.
My father worked at a steel mill
mm-hmm.
for 30 years. And my mother worked for the school system in the cafeteria,
oh, wow.
which meant you couldn't get by with anything because mom knew everybody. And if I did anything, she got the story before I even got home. No, it was a good place.
Oh, what steel mill did your father work for?
Armco.
What took you to Toledo?
Work.
Mm-hmm.
I worked for 3 years, I think it was, at the local Job and Family Services office. And then a job came open at the regional office in Toledo. And our director from the local agency had become the district director. And I really liked working for him. So I took the job and moved to Toledo.
And how old were you when you moved to Toledo?
Oh, that's a good question. 26? Maybe 25, 26. And a large part of it was part of coming out. Mm-hmm. Being gay in Marion wouldn't have been easy, and it wouldn't have been easy for my parents. So I was very happy to get out of Marion and go someplace with a broader community. And Toledo is so much like that. Toledo is really an amazing, overgrown small town. There's generally only a couple degrees of separation between people. You may not know somebody, but you'll find out their brother goes to the same doctor you do, or their sister works in the same place you do. Toledo's a really interesting town.
Mm-hmm. Did you find Toledo to be much more accepting than you thought Marion would be?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's an actual developed gay community, even in 1979 when I moved there. Mm-hmm. And I got involved in some organizations and helped do speaking engagements, and it really helped me grow up and accept myself for who I am.
Mm-hmm. Did you find that surprising to find Toledo so accepting?
You know, I never thought of it, but yeah, in some ways. But it was there when I moved there, so I just picked up and ran with it.
At what age did you realize that you were gay? How old were you when that?
Well, I think I was my mid-20s. I have a really good friend who was like my best friend in high school, actually in elementary school through high school. And he had come out, and we hadn't seen each other for a really long time, and we got reacquainted. And it just was very fortunate for me. Mm-hmm. Because I just started to realize who I was mm-hmm. and how I wanted to live my life. Mm. He was very supportive.
And did he come out in Marion?
Yes.
How do you know any?
Well, we had like gone different directions for school at that point, so I don't really know. We never really talked about it that much. If there were anything important, challenging happened or anything, but he came out before I did.
Mm-hmm. So what were the organizations that you got involved with in Toledo when you arrived?
Well, when I got to Toledo, there was one organization called Pro Toledo. It stood for the Personal Rights Organization. It was sort of the non-religious based group. There were other groups. One was called Dignity, which was essentially for Catholics who weren't comfortable in their local parish or church. In fact, Louis would often do Mass. Since he had originally been a priest, he would often do Mass for Dignity. In Toledo, Dignity was even kind of open to any denomination because there wasn't really there were several other organizations. I think there was one for Lutherans, but I can't think of who the other ones were. But I just picked up and ran with the organizations that were there. Pro Toledo did speaking groups, and they'd originally started in the 60s as an offshoot of what was called the Mattachine Society, which I believe started in Chicago. And in the early 70s, there were problems with police entrapping gay people who would just be interested in talking to people and maybe finding a date or whatever. And depending on how the conversation went, the police would see it as entrapment, importuning for sex, I think is what it is. Mm-hmm. And they were a resource for people like that to call. They had lists of attorneys and things like that. But then they provided social events. There was a Tuesday night get-together that was intended to be a non-alcoholic option for people to get together with instead of going to the bar. So, and back then the bar was where everybody went. Mm-hmm. Nothing was online. There was no online.
Right. Well, that sounds like a lot of resources for, as you said, kind of a small, large town.
I agree.
Yeah.
You know, Toledo has other advantages. Toledo is such an interesting mixture of ethnic folks from different places around the world. We have a leading politician who is retired now. When he was a kid, he and his family came to Toledo because they were fleeing the communist revolution in Hungary. And we have a neighborhood of a lot of people who did that and kind of create their own culture in that neighborhood and have a yearly festival. There's a huge number of Hispanic folks in Toledo. There were two very large Polish communities in Toledo. One was called La Grinka, and the other one was called Kuszpans. And I know what they mean, but I won't say it. But Toledo has an amazing level of cultural diversity. It's a very opening, warm, loving city in a lot of ways. I really like it.
Can you tell me a little bit about like the gay community in Toledo? What are the places that are important to the gay community in Toledo?
Well, you know, when I first moved there, the center of all activity was either an organization or the bars. And at that time, there were like 5 gay bars. Today, there's only one actual gay bar, and then there's one bar that was a gay bar that's been purchased by a married couple, and he and she love the gay community, so it's a bit of everybody's bar. But most folks met each other by going out to the bar, or like I said, the organizations. There were several religious-based organizations for people who didn't fit in their own home churches anymore. And then there was the generic one, the one that I belonged to, that was Personal Rights Organization. And then people would have parties, and you would meet people at parties. That's all I can think of at that point.
One of the bars, excuse me, one of the bars is one of the oldest gay bars in Ohio. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
I do. It was called the Scenic. It had been there since the 50s, back when people would go with sport coats and ties, and they would have a piano, and people would play the piano and show tunes, of course. And then there was a drag bar that was famous and infamous. There were several other bars that maybe met different styles. One bar was a little more like just a nightclub. Another bar was people in jeans. They didn't dress up very much. That was something that was surprising for me for a small town kid. That's not something I'd ever considered or understood, except for the bars down here. When I first came out, I would come down here to some of the bars, since was only an hour away in Marion. But there was a pretty affirming community in Toledo. Among those people that met each other at the bar or met each other at parties, their own little social groups would fall out. And people would spend time together. And then there's a neighborhood in Toledo that's one of the older neighborhoods that's just off of downtown. It's beautiful. It's called the Old West End. And a lot of folks in the gay community would move down there because there's a large population of gay people there. Now, gay folks have moved out all over the city. But they also have a yearly festival. So it was an opportunity for people to get out and meet each other in public. And the houses are so beautiful. They do tours during the festival and they do tours at Christmas time. It's just itself its own wonderful community. A place where you walk down the street and you see somebody on the porch, you just go up and talk. Yeah, it's part of Toledo's charm.
You mentioned coming down to Columbus to go to the gay bars.
Yes.
That is, we're always interested in that because it's important to the LGBT community, and a lot of that history there's not a lot of official advertisements for that kind of stuff, so we're always interested in what kind of bars there were. Which ones did you go to? Oh,
now that's going way back.
Yeah.
The one that comes to mind is I think it was the Kismet, was on 3rd Street, and there was more of a leather jeans bar next to it, and I can't remember the name of that one.
Tradewinds?
Yes, it was Tradewinds, and that's back when disco was really popular. There was a women's bar on Wall Street, I remember. I was there once or twice. Then there were some more suburban bars, but I don't remember what they were called. I spent a lot of time at Tradewinds and the Kismet. And then there was a bar on Long Street, I think, open called The Garage, which was really impressive because when you first walked in, the bar was just like a neighborhood bar. But when you went through the doors in the back, there was a huge dance area in the back that was almost the size of half a basketball stadium. And just alive and full of activity. And I remember at that age, any bar I went to was so exciting. And then somewhere in my 30s, it was like, it's just another bar. Those were times.
Well, tell me about meeting Louis.
Louis and I met in 1988. He and I had both seen the same psychologist. This was at the point where HIV/AIDS was really an issue. And he had decided to create a support group, a wellness group, a support group for people who had HIV or AIDS. And he wanted some facilitators to be part of the group. And he liked the way the two of us communicated. At that point, we hadn't met each other. And it was when Louis joined the group, I'd already been part of the group. When Louis joined the group, we first met each other that night and just got interested and became friends. And from friends went on to a 32-year relationship.
So can you tell me a little bit about Louis's background?
Louis had a really interesting background as far as I'm concerned. Mom didn't speak English that much at the time, so the family had those challenges. And as the boys grew up, he has 2 brothers. As the boys grew up, they were kind of helping Mom. But then she would learn English, and they moved into a neighborhood in Toledo that was one of the Polish neighborhoods. So here's this Mexican-American family in a neighborhood where the local parish is a national parish. It's largely Polish folks. So his family had to actually go ask the priest if it would be okay if the kids went to school in this parish. And he really liked Louis's mom and dad, so he said, okay. Well, as a result, at least from the way I see him, as a result, Louis learned to be concerned about the whole community. And Louis learned to build bridges. He wasn't the kind of activist for the gay community or the Hispanic community that was so totally focused on each community's issues that he couldn't interact with and build bridges and agreements with other people. His focus as a city councilman was on what was best for the city, not what's best for one group or another. And I think that's a large part of what made him so successful. He was on council for 8 years, and 3 of those years he was president of city council. And he used to refer to it as trying to herd cats.
Wow.
He was an interesting person.
Yeah. And he, you mentioned that he originally trained in the priesthood.
He did. He was in the seminary originally in the late 70s. He served for 5 years in various different parishes, and then decided to leave. The church is like a lot of organizations. Louis was a very Louis had a lot of self-confidence, and it served him well. And in jobs, when you're young and you're starting out, often you have to suffer fools wisely. And that wasn't Louis's strength. And Louis would complain about things, and people would see him as the problem, when in fact he was complaining about legitimate things. But in an organization, sometimes that doesn't go well. So at one point he decided, I'm out of here. But never did he lose his commitment to serving the community, which is why he went on and worked in mental health. He worked in substance abuse. He was a counselor for the county sheriff's department. He was a probation officer for the city for years. He worked and ran a mental health program at a time when they were trying to get folks out of institutions who had been institutionalized for years. They were trying to create an environment with supportive services so people who had the supportive services could stay outside of the institution. Mm-hmm. He dedicated his life, his whole life was to serving the community.
Do you remember the name of the mental health program?
Sure, it was called SILP, Supported Independent Living, and it was part of the Zeph Center in Toledo. He was a manager for the community services program.
It's interesting that he got into the priesthood. What was Louis's coming out experience like?
That's an interesting question. Louis wasn't fond of coming out. It was, straight people don't have to come out. Why do I have to come out? Mm-hmm. And in our house, we would always have one bedroom, which was like, well, do you have to ask? Mm-hmm. And his coming out was kind of in the local newspaper because in 92 or 93, they did an article about him being openly gay. And it was in the newspaper. And the only person he had really told up front was his mom. So some of the family members read about it in the newspaper. That was kind of his way of doing things.
Wow.
Yeah. It was very self-confident and very effective.
Mm-hmm. Did he have any struggles with his faith?
I think he himself, when he was younger, before we met, he had gone into counseling. Mm-hmm. And I think it really helped him resolve his issues about who he was. And he was okay with who he was. And it made him confident and made him very good at serving the community. You
mentioned that he had some issues with the organization, but do you know why he left the priesthood?
Oh, it was the authority thing. Mm-hmm. Well, as I was describing, it's like in most places, like I worked for the state of Ohio for 30 years. And when I first started out, there were times and places where there were people who were in charge who didn't have maybe the best motivations. And you were just a captive audience. You had to deal with it. And that was not Louis's style. And he would do things. For instance, he was in a parish in a small town I won't name, where the priest may very well have been an alcoholic. And the priest demanded that everyone at dinner not talk to each other at all. Dinner was supposed to be completely silent, to the point that everybody had their own salt and pepper shakers, bowls, everything. And all Louis did was say, I'm really not comfortable with that. Can I have dinner in my room? And that became some sort of act of rebellion or whatever, and was the first time I think he got sent to the bishop. Mm. And things like that continued to happen until finally he realized, I just can't do this, and decided to go off and be on his own. And that's when he got the job as a probation officer, and he worked for the city for many years as a probation officer.
Hmm. So he's got a real heart for community.
Oh, totally. That was his primary motivation in life. In fact, there's a funny story. When he was a little kid, like 12, he'd already decided he wanted to be a priest. And when he would get in the car with his dad, he would button his shirt up, including the top button. And his dad would reach over and unbutton the top button, and Louis would button the button again. Because even at that age, he knew that's what he wanted to do.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, it must have been a bit of a struggle for him, having this have been his dream since such a young age, and then to kind of move on from it.
But it wasn't, because he never saw himself as anything other than a priest. His life never stopped being dedicated to the community. He just found new and different and many ways to do that. That's just who he was. Mm. I mean, it worked for him. Like I said, he worked in so many different fields. I think that's one of the reasons he got elected, because he was elected for an at-large seat, and there were so many communities of people in Toledo that he had touched that knew him and knew what a wonderful person he was. And it's so unusual for anyone, to run for an at-large seat for city council and win the first time. Mm-hmm. He had sitting city council people saying, now, don't get discouraged. You may have to run 2 or 3 times, but to everyone's surprise, he got elected the first time.
Do you know what the margin of victory was?
I do. I've got 2 figures in my head. I'm trying to remember which one was which. The person who got more, there were 6 seats. He got the 6th seat. I think the person who got the 5th seat was like 4,000 votes more than him, and the person who would have gotten the seat if she hadn't have been 7th was like 5,000 or 6,000 fewer. Mm-hmm. So he did really well. Mm-hmm. He had signs all over town. One of the radio DJs at the point would say, well, Louis Escobar has obviously won the war of the political signs, because his signs were everywhere. And he called himself Toledo's candidate. It was a very, very accurate description. Mm-hmm. He used to frustrate, if you're a Republican or if you're a Democrat, you sort of have these natural groups of people that support you. And Louis wasn't one to take influence from, say, unions or companies. Louis would see what he thought was the best for the community, which wouldn't endear him sometimes to the natural groups of people who would normally support him. But ultimately, I think he was very, very effective as a council person, and worked endless hours with both the Hispanic organizations and the gay community to provide services for people.
What were his real passions that brought him to wanting to run for city council?
Housing discrimination. He was on our Fair Housing Commission's board for, not commission, our Fair Housing group's board for years. He worked as a board member and leader in the homeless community. Obviously, he worked wherever he could to further the issues that related to either the Hispanic community or the gay community. I mean, he served in various different gay groups and became a great liaison between the city and those groups. Whatever group of people they were, Louis was very willing to be out there and be a liaison between them and the city. He was instrumental in working with the HIV/AIDS community at a time when people were dying because there really wasn't any effective treatment. And he became the person who ran the wellness group I mentioned before and did yearly fundraisers and organized the group. He did service wherever he could do service.
What was his, did he have a platform he ran on for that kind of race, or is it more of just a name getting out
Well, I
there?
think his name, his natural name recognition in the city helped him. But like I said, his platform was Toledo's candidate. He wasn't championing any special issue. It was just the city of Toledo and making Toledo better. He was instrumental in passing an ordinance after he just got elected. He was sponsor of and got an ordinance passed that banned discrimination based on gender, sexual orientation, or HIV/AIDS status. It banned discrimination in housing accommodations, employment, a variety of things. And the interesting thing was that was in 1998. And at that time, there were 12 council people. And the ordinance passed with 11 votes yes and 1 abstention. And here he is, a new council person, and he just got on council, and he was so effective that he organized the effort to pass the ordinance, and it won by a resounding majority. And then years later, the city passed an ordinance creating domestic partnerships, and he was instrumental in making sure that included gay couples. He served wherever he could.
Did you and he suffer any discrimination when he ran for city council?
Well, he got death threats, which scared his mom to death, but he went through it anyway. We were alike in some respects, that we knew who we were, and we would have friends who would say they'd have trouble if one person went in the hospital, and we never did because we were just who we were. And if somebody had a problem with it, it really wasn't our problem. I'm trying to think. I don't remember him saying, see, it was just such a confident, energetic person. And that I don't remember him saying that, now that I think about it.
He became president of the city council.
Yes, he was president for 3 years.
Can you tell me about how that came about?
He wanted to be president. He put his name forward, and there were 2 other people on council who also wanted to be president, and he had a really good working relationship with our existing mayor at the time. And I think that's how it all fell together. So he was president for 3 years.
You talked about the non-discrimination law or bill that he got passed. Were there other things that he worked on that you'd like to mention?
I can't think of anything in particular that stuck out. I do remember a moment when he came home and he had been struggling to understand the overall budget. And there was one day in one afternoon in one meeting where somehow or other it just all fell together. And he came home with the biggest smile on his face because it's like, I can see the big picture. I know how to rob Peter to pay Paul. That may not be the way to put it, but I know whose budgets are controlled by what cost centers. And he was so excited that he had figured all that out. And you can imagine it was a bit of a challenge, the size of the city of Toledo. He was very happy to be able to serve on council.
In 2021, am I correct about that? He was honored with the renaming of a road.
He was.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about?
Well, there's a city council a sitting city council person, Nick Comives, who called and said that several of them were considering doing it, and it was going to be something that was done in association with Pride, the Pride Month. And I was just really excited to hear they were going to do it. And they managed to, they got a majority of people on council who wanted to do it. And the thing I remember is the night they passed the resolution renaming the street in Louis's name, his mom and I and the family were at the council meeting. And we got to stand up and talk with the city council representatives. And 3 of the people on city council said, he's the reason they were there, because it was his initiative and his encouragement that helped them decide they could do this. And they gave him credit for them being there, which I thought there was no better commendation for him.
So he served 2 terms. Could he have gone on longer?
Yes, he could have gone on longer, but at the point of his 3rd term, he was having back problems and starting to have heart issues because he was diabetic. And that was kind of the beginning of his downhill health cycle. He decided on his own that he really needed to, because like he said, that was like trying to herd cats. And he had a thing for consensus. And within some groups, you just can't build consensus, particularly when the other people have their own egos and their own pathways. And I think he wisely decided that it would have been better not to run for a 3rd term. And then several people tried to get him to run for mayor, and he would entertain the idea, but then his health got in the way, and he just couldn't do it.
Wow, a run for mayor. That would have been...
Oh, he would have been a great mayor. He really would have been a great mayor.
Well, can you tell us a little bit of something about him personally? What kind of things did he like or dislike?
Well, a lot of his life, like I said, was community service. So at one point, he was working not only as a city councilman full-time, but he also worked in a multicultural student center at the University of Toledo. So a lot of his activities revolved around that, fundraisers and events and things in the city that included in his own interests, things to do with the Hispanic community, things to do with the gay community, one group after another. He was always out campaigning and always out encouraging people to participate in the process. And then his board activities, he was on the financial board at the Northwest Ohio Community College in Archbold. He just provided service everywhere that he could think of to do it. He was an EAP counselor for a while, working with employees at, I think it was Owens Corning. And that's what he did.
And you both worked on the Toledo AIDS Task Force. Am I correct about that?
Well, he actually worked on the Toledo AIDS Task Force. I never actually officially worked for them. I worked with the group I had mentioned before called Pro Toledo, which did a lot of work helping in the community. And I also was a member of the wellness group. But Louis actually worked for the AIDS Task Force. He was an AIDS educator. At that time in the 80s when people were dying, we were in the bars, he was passing out condoms, educational literature, going places and speaking. That was a major effort for him. That is one of the biggest things that he did. And he also worked, Toledo had a hospice center, kind of a hospice center for folks who had HIV and AIDS issues, because at that time there were funeral homes that wouldn't take people who had passed away from AIDS, ambulance drivers who wouldn't take somebody in the ambulance if they thought the person was HIV positive. We had one of the greatest resources in town was one of the nurses at our, it was MCO, one of our hospitals, who actually would go in and help do surgeries when there were other nurses who wouldn't. Mm-hmm. And they worked together. Her name was Ann Loker. She was an amazing force in Toledo, like Louis was. Mm. And they worked together for many things.